Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's message. I'm Eric, the lead pastor of South Mountain Community Church. Thank you for taking just a bit of your time to be with us today. We exist for one reason, and that's to help as many people as possible take their next step towards becoming fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Jesus Christ. And I know that for so many people, church and even religion can be messy and oh so complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way. Here you can belong before you believe. So our hope is that your first visit with us is enjoyable, meaningful, and unlike the church experiences of your past. We also think that the best way to experience delight is with others in person. So SMCC is about more than just a Sunday sermon. We have 5 locations for you to choose from where you can connect with people in authentic community. We want every message you hear to engage your head, your heart, and your hands for a life of full delight. So with all of that in mind, enjoy today's message.
Well, hey, good morning. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here at SMCC. Just want to say thanks for joining us this Sunday. Now, one of the things that I have noticed about 21st century modern life is that it involves, at least for me, a whole lot of sitting. For example, if I look at my schedule in my life, kind of Monday through Friday, most of the time when I'm at work, I'm sitting either in my office or in a meeting or in a coffee shop or somewhere like that, right? And when I break for lunch, I end up at a table with some friends sitting again. And in the morning when I have breakfast and in the evening when I have dinner, I'm sitting some more. And on the way to work and on the way back home, I'm sitting in my car. My life consists of a whole lot of sitting. And my guess is that your life does too. And the trouble is, this isn't necessarily a good thing. For example, Yale Medicine says this about it, that research has linked prolonged sitting or other sedentary behavior to diabetes, poor heart health, weight gain, depression, dementia, and multiple cancers, meaning the impact on our lives of sedentary lifestyles and prolonged sitting, as many of us are even sitting right now in this room, is anything but beneficial. But the good news is that there are also small things that we can add into our lives that change them drastically. For example, how many people have dogs in the room? Go ahead and throw up a hand. All right, quite a few, good stuff. If you have cats, you might not appreciate this statistic as much, but the American Heart Association, they once said that dog owners are 31% less likely to die from a heart attack or stroke than non-dog owners. People with prior heart events who had a dog living at home had a 65% reduced risk of death, meaning one of the most significant next steps you can take to benefit your heart health is actually to get a dog, even if it's a golden doodle, right? The benefits are still there. I'm sorry if I hurt anyone. I'm sorry if that hurt. But the reason I mention this is because even though we sit in church, we aren't to be sedentary in Christ, right? Maybe our lives consist of a lot of sitting, but the life that Jesus invites us into isn't one that is primarily sedentary. Today, we're continuing our series called Body Theology, which is all about the connections between our physical bodies and our spiritual lives. A brand new series we started for a brand new year. And the reason we're delving into this topic is because it's one in which there are a lot of different opinions, a lot of different disagreements, many different questions that oftentimes leave us with confusion, with a lack of clarity surrounding our bodies and really how we are to navigate life as people with bodies. And so the goal is to move into all of these different opinions and disagreements and questions in a way that is hopeful, that is helpful, and that provides some clarity. And to do that, we've got really this structure for the series. Across these 4 weeks, we're looking at these 4 questions. Last week, we opened up with this question, or really this set of questions that was, who does my body belong to and what is my body for? Just kind of laying the foundation for these 4 weeks. Now today, we're continuing the conversation, taking it a step further by looking at the second question in the set, which says, how do I honor Jesus with my body? What does that look like? And let me say this, that you may be here and you may be thinking to yourself, man, this is unfortunate because I have no interest whatsoever in the answer to that question. I could care less how to honor Jesus with my body. And that may be where you're at. But let me just say this, that our main idea, really our thesis for the entire series, is that when you embrace God's truth for your body, you will find and be at peace with your own body. which is significant because one of the statistics we covered last week is that 90% of Americans are unhappy with their bodies, meaning even in a room this size, the vast majority of us on any given day would actually say that there is an absence of peace. There's a lack of peace with the bodies that we have. And so I think that means that there's something to be gleaned for all of us, no matter where we're coming from with this series, or at least that's the hope anyway. And so that being the case, how do I honor Jesus with my body? I want to start with one passage written by the Apostle Paul, significant author in the New Testament, leader in the first century as well, first century church, where he's writing to this church located in the city of Rome in the first century. And he says something to them in chapter 12 of this letter that really tees up our conversation for today. So this is what he says. Chapter 12, verse 1. He says, therefore, meaning because of everything that I've said up until this point, because of chapters 1 through 11, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Now, if we're familiar with that verse at all, if it's something that we've heard before, I think there can be a tendency to kind of gloss over something within it that is actually particularly striking, especially if we're to listen with the ear of a first century audience. Because one of the things this church in Rome, as they're reading the letter, would have been familiar with is the notion of sacrifice. Because all throughout the Roman Empire, there were so many different temples and religions that involved sacrifice as a fundamental part of what it was to worship those gods. Right? You would take something and sacrifice it. And so we have a tendency to kind of gloss over because we think of sacrifice and we think of, I'm giving up my daily latte so I can save up for my trip to Disneyland. That's my sacrifice, right? But with them, a sacrifice was an animal. It was a pigeon or a goat or a lamb or an ox or something like that. And the sacrifice did not walk away. And so when Paul in this passage introduces the concept of a living sacrifice, and he's saying, I don't want you to offer an animal, I want you to offer yourself, offer your body as a living sacrifice. It's an entirely new concept that is striking. And I think what he's getting at is really this connection, that how you treat your body is a picture of how you worship God. That there's a connection even with the way that we use and the way that we care for our bodies and how we worship God. And to break it down, I think there's one word that kind of helps bring some clarity here. The word is sanctification. It comes from the Greek word for holy, and it really means to sanctify something means to make something holy. And for something to be holy is for it to be set aside specifically for God's purposes, to be dedicated to God's purposes. And so what Paul is saying when he says, I urge you, I invite you, I challenge you, I instruct you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice to God. He's saying, I want you to dedicate your body for the purposes of God, which at the very least lays the foundation for our conversation today and shows that we are at the very least justified in asking the question, how do I honor Jesus with my body? Because that's the very thing that Paul is instructing this church in Rome to do some 2,000 years ago. And so the question that follows from that is, well, what does that look like? How do we honor Jesus with our bodies? How do we dedicate our bodies to God's purposes? I think to answer that question, I want to move in kind of two different directions today. I want to explore two different subjects, you could say. And the first really has to do with desires, and the second has to do with care, how we care for our bodies. So how we navigate the desires of our bodies and how we navigate caring for our bodies are the two different directions I want to go that I think get us most of the way in answering this question together. And so let's jump into the first one, which has to do with desires. I want to flip back a couple of pages to Romans chapter 6. Same letter, same author, same audience, just a different portion of the letter where Paul says something that really helps us kind of have a framework for approaching desires. And this is what he says, chapter 6, verse 11. In the same way, count yourselves dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. In the same way as what, you could ask? Well, just prior to this, he's talking about how Jesus has lived, died, and risen again, and how when we place trust in him, in a way, we're united with him in that process. It's as if we are with him in his death and in his resurrection. And so there's a spiritual transformation that has taken place where fundamentally something is different about us as a result of the trust we've placed in him. And so we've died to the life we used to live without him, and we've risen into this newness of life with him on the other side. And baptism actually is a picture of this, as he talks about earlier in this passage. But he's saying in the same way as this is true, count yourselves dead to sin, sin being rebellion against God, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body so that you obey its evil desires. Do not offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life. And offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness. For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. And that final note is particularly important when he says you're not under the law, but you're under grace. Because I think we could come into the conversation thinking that what Paul is saying is you need to live in a particular way, that you need to honor God with your body, you need to kind of reject these things over here, and you need to lean into these things over here, because if you don't, if you misstep, if you make a mistake, God's gonna be upset with you, he's gonna be angry, disappointed, he's gonna punish you, he's gonna withhold good things from your life. And that is a relationship with God that is based on the law. And Paul's saying that that's not the kind of relationship you have with God, that that's not what you're under. You're under grace, right? Where Jesus offered his death in your behalf and then rose from the grave to invite you into this relationship with God that is based on love, based on delight, that God loves and delights in you, has adopted you as his child, that he is for you. And there's nothing that you can do to take that away, to disappoint him or make him angry or persuade him to punish you. And so in light of the love and the delight that he has in you, in response to that, Paul is saying, I want you to live in this way. I want you to pursue a life that is honoring to God. And in particular, as he's unpacking that, he leans into desires. Now, the interesting thing is that Paul's message about desires here in this passage is far from the only messages that we get about desires in this life. And I think culturally speaking, there's a whole lot of messages about desire that we hear that are swirling around that at times I think can lead us to kind of enter into trying to navigate them in a way that's very difficult, very challenging, very confusing. For example, some of the cultural messages can be that you should follow your heart, meaning you should follow your desires. Some of the messaging can even say that you are your desires, that your desires in a way define your identity and define who you are. So to avoid them, to not pursue them is actually in some way to cause harm to yourself. And I think at times these messages, they can be well-intentioned, but ultimately, if you follow them to their logical conclusion, they're not that practically beneficial. I think they end up leading to more confusion than anything. And you can see that just by asking a couple of questions. First off, what happens when I have conflicting desires within my life? All right, for example, and this is a silly example, but let's say I have a desire to, stay here in Utah, take the responsibilities, the opportunities that I've been given within work, and I want to do my best with them. I want to be at home a faithful husband and a good and present father. I want to manage these responsibilities well. That's one set of desires. But on the other hand, as a kid who grew up in the Midwest, I want to make good on my dreams of one day moving to the coast and learning how to surf, which any Midwest kid will tell you are dreams will never be fulfilled, that will never come to pass. And so these are mutually exclusive, right? I can't fulfill both of them. And so how do you go about navigating them? Because if they have to do with my identity, if they're part of who I am, then to reject any of them is to reject part of myself and to cause harm to myself. And so I think it ends up being difficult to navigate desires in that way. And a secondary question would be, if your identity arises out of your desire, then how long do you have to possess a desire before it becomes part of who you are? Before it becomes one of the factors that defines who you are? Because honestly, my desires are constantly shifting and changing. They are not stable. They do not stay the same, but they change year over year, month over month, even day over day. And if I'm to look to these to give me a sense of understanding concerning who I am, what I'm gonna find is a constantly shifting and changing and even fragile understanding of who I am, which is anything but helpful when it comes to trying to navigate this life and these conflicting desires that we all have. And so I think the messages can be well-intentioned, but ultimately they lead to more incoherence and confusion than anything. Whereas what Paul says in this passage is ultimately that when it comes to desires, if we're to navigate them well, if we're to honor Jesus with our bodies, what we have to be able to do is to categorize our desires. And the two categories that he offers are basically those desires that would be honoring to God to pursue and those that would not be honoring to God to pursue. To basically take any desire that we feel, to filter it through the lens of those categories and then to respond to it appropriately on that basis. And now, truth be told, right, if you're not someone who would consider yourself a Christian, if you haven't trusted Jesus with your life, then I don't think it really makes any sense to submit your desires to him, because why would you trust him with these if you haven't trusted him with your life? But if you've made the decision to trust Jesus with the entirety of your life and who you are, then I think part of what's involved in that, part of what's involved in the life that Jesus really invites us into is trusting him with our desires. Trusting him enough to navigate the desires that we have, the vast array and mixture of desires that each and every one of us possess. Trust him enough to navigate them in this particular way, where we filter them through the lens of these categories and respond to them as such. For example, I think maybe one desire that arises for many of us, maybe it's something that you felt, but I think in 21st century modern life, one of the things that exists is that with the digital world and everything that comes with it, you could say that hookup culture has never been more easily accessible, nor has it been more anonymous. And the temptation or the desire can arise to engage with that, to participate that in a way and utilize your body really as this pleasure-seeking tool. And yet what Jesus invites us into is to submit that desire to him. You could also say that in the midst of a life that at times can be incredibly stressful and burdensome, there are different desires that arise to take different substances, to take, like, for example, food, to take alcohol, to take even different medicine, and to use it in a way that is abusive and even damaging, that is harmful to our bodies. And what it means to trust Jesus with our desires is to submit that desire to him. And even beyond that, I think when you get into the category of sexuality, this is a really important conversation. To say that when it comes to sexuality, to trust Jesus enough to be willing to submit those desires to him, right? To submit the desires to him, even to the extent that we're not willing to pursue those desires outside of the design that God has for marriage, is a significant next step of trust. And yet we honestly and earnestly believe, I honestly believe that Jesus invites us into a life that is marked by peace, that is marked by joy. And the way those things are found is through trust. And so I think when it comes to answering the question, how do we honor Jesus? How do I honor Jesus with my body? I think one of the most significant pieces of that conversation has to do with trusting him and a willingness to submit our desires to him through the lens of the categories that he offers us of that which is honoring to him and that which is not. And again, it's all through grace, right? In response to grace, not under the law. And so that's the first half of our conversation. The second half has to do with care and with really stewardship of the body, taking care of the body. And to get into this one, I want to look at just another passage that I think sets up the framework for us. And again, it's written by Paul, but it's written to a different church. It's not in Romans, it's in 1 Corinthians, which was written to a church located in the city of Corinth. And they had a lot of different things going on, but in this one passage, he talks to them about their bodies and really about the Christian life as a whole. And this is what he says, 1 Corinthians 9:24. He says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize?" At least in the first century, that was true. Now we have ribbons and medals that go all the way up to 8, 9, and 10. And I'm thankful to have had some of those in my mom's basement before she sold her house. But he says, run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. He's saying they go through all of these regiments, all of this work, all of this strict training to earn something that will ultimately fade and wither and be forgotten. But you've been invited, right, to pursue something that does not fade, that will never wither and will matter for all of eternity. And so he goes on to say, therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly, not wandering haphazardly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air, wasting punches. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. And really what Paul is saying here is, after inviting other people into a life of intentionality surrounding God's purposes, a life of peace and joy, he's saying, I don't want to miss out on that myself. I don't want to lose focus or get sloppy or feel the pain of one day recognizing that I have settled for an unintentional life. Paul's saying, I don't want that. And to invite them into an intentional life themselves, to invite them into a life of honoring Jesus with their lives and with their bodies, he uses this metaphor of professional athletes, which is interesting because when you look at professional athletes, even today, whether it's Olympic athletes or professional baseball or football players or professional pickleball players, or is pickleball a real sport? Any word on that? It's kind of funny sometimes when a game will develop and it'll try and make its way into becoming a sport. I had some friends in college who at one point they were bragging to me that spike ball had just come into existence. And they're like, we're ranked in like the top 60 in the world. And my internal response was like, well, yeah, because it's not a sport, it's a game. It's like being really good at Hungry Hungry Hippo. It's cool, but it's not the same thing. And I'm not sure where pickleball is in that mess, but I will say that professional athletes, one thing we do know is that they have to go into strict training with their diet, with their regimens, with their rest even. All of that is an important piece of the equation, that in order to have excellent performance, devotion is required. And Paul's making the same point about the Christian life, that if we want to honor Jesus with our bodies well and with our lives well, it requires the same exact thing. Right? That excellent performance requires devotion. And so I think really what that looks to, I think sometimes we can get caught up leaning into some other ways of approaching life and approaching the body that aren't particularly helpful. And I just want to walk through a couple of those. And I think you could break it down like this, that God doesn't want us to neglect, reject, or perfect our bodies, but rather direct our bodies. Right? That he's not inviting us to neglect, reject, or perfect our bodies, but rather to direct them. And you could ask, well, what does it mean to neglect, reject, or perfect? And neglect means to fail to take care of something. And so to neglect our bodies is really to fail to care for them in a way that is adequate, where they're not getting the rest they need, they're not getting the adequate nutrition, they're not getting basically what they need in order to sustain themselves to be able to serve God well. In order to really fulfill the responsibilities that we have in this life, it's possible to neglect our bodies to the extent that we can no longer fulfill the responsibilities or even the opportunities that we have. And so that's neglect. And when it comes to reject and perfect, I think a lot of times that can be like a pendulum that we get caught within. And if I'm honest with you, this is where I end up a lot of times, is kind of on this pendulum where on the one hand, you can end up rejecting your body, where I think what that feels like, what that can look like, is you have a body that is a gift from God. It is a good and a wonderful thing. As we looked at last week, Psalm 139 says, God, all your works are wonderful. And the writer acknowledges that he is one of them, meaning his body is one of them. And that's true for each and every one of us, that your body is actually a work of God that has been given to you that is good. It's not perfect. We wrestle with brokenness, but it is a good and an incredible gift that you have been given. And yet sometimes we can get caught up rejecting that gift, where when we look in the mirror, the body that we see isn't something that we like, right? That we don't like our bodies. We don't like how we feel in our bodies. In some ways, we even respond at times with a feeling of disgust to our bodies, that we can even hate our bodies. And that can be an incredibly painful thing to live in. And I think a lot of times when we're stuck in that, we can end up sliding out of it into the attempt to perfect our bodies, which is where the body actually becomes the most important thing within our lives. Our finances, our schedule, our budget, our nutrition, everything ends up oriented around perfecting our bodies, because the belief is that if we can just make them as they're intended to be, if we can just perfect our bodies so it looks just the way we need it to, then finally we will be able to love and to accept our bodies as they are, but not until they're perfect. I think the attempt to perfect our bodies arises out of the pain of rejecting our bodies majority of the time. But when that's the case, when we fall for that way of life, what ends up happening is our bodies actually replace God in our life. No longer is our body something that we use to honor Jesus. It's become the God that we worship, because it's become the most important thing in our lives. And whenever that's the case, whenever something takes the place of God within our lives, you can bet that that thing will fail you, because it is not God. And so when it does, when we find ourselves coming up short, not looking good enough, not seeing what we need to see, that our body isn't what we need it to be, we end up sliding directly out of the attempt to perfect it and right into rejecting it and hating it all over again. We get caught in this pendulum between rejection and perfection and rejection and perfection. And it's an incredibly painful thing to be in. And I think instead of those strategies, instead of neglect, instead of rejection, instead of perfection, what Jesus is inviting us into when it comes to honoring him with our bodies is really to care for them, to receive them as the gift that they are, and to enjoy them, and ultimately to take care of them so that we're able to serve him well. And I think it looks like this, that we move the body, care for the body, discipline the body, and train the body for service to Jesus. Right? That we care for our bodies in such a way so that we're equipped to be able to serve Jesus and even manage the responsibilities that we have in this life well. And I think one of the interesting things about this is that, 21st century modern life is the theme we've had throughout our conversation today, that a lot of it is made up of white collar work, which tends to not have anything to do with the body for the most part, right? That I don't need to be strong to be a pastor, thankfully, or else I would have looked elsewhere for employment. But there is still a benefit in this regard. For example, John Rady was a professor of psychiatry at Harvard, and as an amateur athlete, he was fascinated throughout his career about the way that the exercise proved to be such an effective medicine for people. And one of the things that he did, he compiled his research in 2008 and published it in a book called Spark. And he talked about the benefits of bodily exercise, not just for the body itself, but also for the brain. And this is what he says. He says, we all know that exercise makes us feel better, but most of us have no idea why. We assume it's because we're burning off stress or reducing muscle tension or boosting endorphins, and we leave it at that. But the reason we feel so good when we get our blood pumping is that it makes the brain function at its best. And in my view, this benefit of physical activity is far more important and fascinating than what it does for the body. Building muscles and conditioning the heart and lungs are essentially side effects. I often tell my patients that the point of exercise is to build and condition the brain. And I think that gets us to a point where we can see that the benefits of exercise are not just physical. It's not just about stronger arms and better lungs and a healthier heart. It's about a more effective brain. And even if the majority of our responsibilities, Monday through Friday, have nothing to do with strength or aerobic conditioning, you can see that one of the ways we can sharpen our skills and equip ourselves to be able to honor Jesus better with the responsibilities we do have is actually through exercise. Right? That exercise in some ways is an important component of discipleship, of how we honor Jesus with our bodies. And so I think that's really the second half of our conversation, of what it looks like to care for our bodies well. And it's significant, right? There's one story that I want to share that I think illustrates how vital this is. There was a preacher in the 19th century by the name of Robert Murray McCheyne, who was an incredibly gifted individual. At 14, graduated from the University of Edinburgh. At 23, he was pastoring a church of 1,000 people. And yet just 6 years later, at the age of 29 years old, he died. his life came to such a sudden and such an early close. And it wasn't because of some horrific accident. It wasn't because of some disease. It wasn't because of some underlying condition. He died from pure physical exhaustion. And he even recognized that on his deathbed, as he was dying, one of the things that he said as he knew that his life was coming to a close was this quote. Now, it's not on the screen or in your notes, but what he said was, God gave me a horse to ride and a message to deliver. Alas, I have killed the horse, and now I cannot deliver the message. Right, he's saying, I had a purpose to fulfill in this life, and it was my joy to fulfill it. And yet I did not care for myself. I did not care for my body, and now I cannot fulfill that purpose. And so absolutely, when it comes to honoring Jesus with our bodies, I think caring for our bodies is a significant piece of the puzzle. And so as we get ready to kind of wrap up today, I just want to offer a few next steps that I think could be helpful. And I know most of us probably already drafted our own list of these types of next steps 2 weeks ago. And so just consider this draft number 2. But to offer my body as a living sacrifice, I will start, stop, and continue. What's something I can start that will allow me to honor Jesus more with my body? What's something I will stop? What's something that I will continue, a good habit or rhythm that I already have built in? And I'm not saying that you need to have one for every one of these, but they're just some helpful frameworks to think through. For example, I'm gonna start going for nightly walks with a friend or my spouse, or I'm gonna stop going to bed past 11 p.m. to give my body the sleep and the rest that it needs. Right? Something to start, something to stop, and something to continue. One thing we wanna invite everyone into as we're going through this series at the beginning of a year called Body Theology, is we want to invite everyone really into a next step that has something to do with both our physical bodies and our spiritual lives. It's a spiritual practice that is connected to both of them intricately, and it's the practice of fasting. And you could look at fasting as the process of going without one desire to fuel another. And most of the time it's understood to be food, right? When you fast, you're fasting from food, giving it up for a certain amount of time. And the way it works as a spiritual practice is every time you begin to feel hungry, you allow that desire to basically draw your attention to the greater need, the greater desire that we have, which is for God and for the relationship we have with Him. So when you feel hunger, instead of going to the fridge, you go to prayer, is the way that fasting works. And so it's a spiritual practice that includes the body and has them both intricately connected. And so as a church, one of the things we want to do is invite everyone to participate in this church-wide fast that's happening on January 31st. A 3-meal fast where on that day, it's a Wednesday, we fast from breakfast, from lunch, and for dinner. And I want to invite you to sign up for this. There's a QR code that you can scan. And you might be asking, well, why do I need to sign up for a fast? Can't I just not eat? You can. But in my experience, every time I've tried to do a fast alone, I oftentimes end up not fasting. And so sometimes it's helpful just to kind of sign up. Plus, we want to send some communication ahead of time to just clarify what fasting is and give some tips and tricks on it. And at the same time, send some encouragement throughout, kind of different emails and communication at the meal times, because let's be honest, fasting is hard. But that's one next step that we want to invite everyone to try and to participate in at the end of this month, January 31st. So all that being said, the bottom line is Jesus is honored when your body is fit to serve His body. And I think two of the most significant conversations for us when it comes to honoring Jesus well with our bodies is the willingness to trust Him and to submit our desires to Him, and the willingness to care for our bodies well so that we're equipped to serve Him well. So would you pray with me? Jesus, we thank you for the chance to talk about our bodies today. We thank you for the chance to continue this series, to learn more about the ways that you have wired us, the ways that you have created us, and to recognize more and more each and every week the incredible gift it is to have these bodies, to be these bodies that you have made for us. And we look forward to the next several weeks where we'll have a chance to move in different directions with the conversation and even lean into some of the brokenness that we experience in this life. And we thank you that you are with us in the midst of that. We We just ask that you would help us to continue to grow in our trust in you and the peace that comes on the other side of that. So we thank you and we praise you in your name. Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's message and trusting us with your time. If you'd like to connect with one of our pastors or staff, you can easily do that by visiting smccutah.org/connect. When you fill out that quick form, they will get back to you within a few days and be able to connect with you. As well, if you'd like to know more about taking a next step at SMCC, you can easily look at what next steps we have by visiting smccutah.org/next steps. And lastly, if you found today's message both hopeful and helpful, I would encourage you to do maybe one of two things. First, you can share this message with someone that would find it helpful. And you can also choose to partner with us financially so that more people can see messages like this. You can find more information on what that looks like by visiting smccutah.org/give. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at one of our locations soon.